Program Quarterly Report.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Ray Zhang, Division Chief of Local Assistance. So you just heard from Emily Abraham talk about the Active Transportation Resource Center and the activities being conducted through the center. And a lot of the activities address the concern that was recently raised because of the lack of the count and be able to demonstrate benefit. So we are also working with the Active Transportation Resource, the Technical Advisory Committee to engage into develop some interim guidelines as far as be able to count the project benefit. So that was just an update that I also wanted to provide, and also wanted to get the commissioners' comment and feedback on the report that we provided. So I'll be brief, since we just spent a lot of time on the resource center.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item 21, SB1. It was so brief we didn't know it was over.
Commissioners, tab 21 is an information item on the SB1 program quarterly report. Staff continues working with Caltrans SB1 office to streamline the report and ensure that report is user-friendly. The goal of this report is to report on positive progress of the programs while identifying high-risk issues soon enough to allow staff time to work with on those projects. We are working with Caltrans on how best to display projects at risk and define what risks require a corrective action plan. Caltrans will be providing an update on the report and their automation efforts.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and Commissioners. My name is Nabila Abi-Rashid, and I'm the Acting Senate Bill 1 Program Manager, and will be providing you with Caltrans' second quarter progress report for the Senate Bill 1 program. The program progress report is required by Senate Bill 1 accountability and transparency guidelines that were adopted by the Commission. This report is for Commission actions done through December 2018. The Senate Bill 1 programs were adopted by the Commission last spring, and this program report includes 5 programs: Solutions for Congested Corridor Program, Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, Local Partnership Program, State Highway Operations and Protection Program, and the Active Transportation Program. At the end of the second quarter, the 5 Senate Bill programs, there has been $23.6 billion Commission dollars programmed on projects, and $5.9 billion Commission dollars allocated on projects, and $1.3 billion Commission dollars awarded to a total of 110 projects. This table reflects the baseline agreements that we have. To date, we have 321 baseline agreements that are required for the Senate Bill 1 program, and 122 baseline agreements have been approved by the end of the second quarter. Another 199 baseline agreements are planned for future Commission meetings. For the Senate Bill 1 programs, there's a number of different items we are working on with staff to improve the report and drive more efficiencies. For the quarterly report, we've provided project data in a searchable format for SHOP and ATP on the SB1 portal. This helped reduce the size of the document that we had presented last go around for the first quarterly report. It made for a much thinner document. We've also been working on a web portal via CalSmart, which is an online project progress reporting tool for our local partners and for Caltrans to more efficiently provide quarterly project status reports on approximately 1,800 projects. This web portal will pre-populate Commission-approved scope, schedule, cost, and benefit data to reduce the number of fields that need to be filled out. This will increase our data accuracy And this portal will also standardize comments or changes and variations in scope, cost, and schedule, benefits, or corrective action plans. We have approximately 500 to 700 project managers using different nomenclatures. By standardizing the process, we'll help streamline this process and clean up ambiguous data. Currently, I'm happy to report that this web portal is now live this week. And so we've sent out invitations to set up accounts along with a user guide to our local partners. All users will begin reporting on the web portal for future quarterly reports. This will create a streamlined process and make it for just an efficient process going forward. We're also working with Commission staff on enhancing our processes. We're developing a format to allow for reporting on completion and final delivery reports. We're also working with Commission staff on recommendations for guidelines and enhancing our processes. Any questions?
Are there any questions? Yes, Commissioner Gometti.
There's a lot to read here. I generally manage by exception. Is there a way that we can just highlight the projects that are behind schedule?
We certainly can do that. And for the next meeting? Yes.
Just a one-page, whatever. So
Summary sheet?
we can drill in on those.
Yes,
Thank you.
we can do that.
Any other questions? So the baseline agreements aren't required on every project, so we have a certain threshold that we require a baseline on. And then, so that number went from, I don't know, on the shop, 1228 or 1226 allocated, and then we have 269, so what, 20% of those have to have a baseline agreement?
Dependent on the guidelines and how
Okay.
it's related in there.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. But then we have 78 approved out of 269, so when do we think, because the baseline agreement's kind of the starting point, right?
Yes. So the 191 future, it's dependent on the guidelines for the shop. And so it's offhand, I'd have to tell you for the next future meetings, I can lay out when we expect them in for the shop, but off the cuff, I don't know when all 191 will be coming in.
Okay.
Would that be helpful?
Well, I guess I don't know if that is a sign of a critical path issue where we have a stumbling block, or is it a sign where we don't have that many projects that are at the point in their project development that they need the baseline agreement?
During the project development process, we're not really at the point to trigger a baseline agreement, so it's really
Okay.
dependent on the guidelines
Okay.
when that trigger happens.
Okay. Director?
Commissioners, this was a question that I thought that the programming deputy, the shop deputy, or it looks like Terry's up here, and Don is up here to help us answer this question. So one of you, please.
I can address for the shop, if that's what you'd like to know. So currently in the guidelines, the shop is required to come in and have a baseline if they meet a threshold before they request the PS&E allocation. I've been reviewing that and having discussions with Caltrans. As that sits right now, it is a stumbling block for project delivery. So as I'm looking at proposals for updates to the shop guidelines, we're looking at a proposal where we can get beyond that so that there's not a pencils down. Because right now, just the way it works in project delivery, it would sort of induce a pencils down situation for them. So hopefully, and that we will be bringing forward in a draft to the commission in May. And so those updated guidelines will include some modifications to shop baselines.
Okay, well, we'll trust your wise guidance on that, but I don't think we want too many pencil down days, because Vince taught us that every day counts, so thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. We'll move on. Item 22, information calendar. Chris, you're up.
Yes, good afternoon, Commissioners. The next 11 agenda items, items 22 through 32, are informational items deemed by staff not to raise any issues, and therefore individual items will not be presented unless specifically requested by a Commissioner.
Are there any requests? Okay, we're good to go. Next item, consent calendar.
Yes, Commissioners, there are 11 agenda items, items 33 through 43, that are on the consent calendar. Please note the following changes to the consent calendar items on the change list, items number 37 and number 39. There were changes to those items. With these noticed changes, Commission staff recommends the Commission approve items 33 through 43 on the consent calendar.
We have a motion by Commissioner Gilmetti, a second by Commissioner Alvaro. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Those motion carries. Okay, now my schedule says bio break, but we're going to say we did that already, so we'll move on to number 44. Chris?
Yes.
Policy matters.
Commissioners, item number 44 is an action item on the draft State Highway System Management Plan. Section 164.6 of the California Streets and Highways Code requires Caltrans to publish a 10-year state highway system management plan as a part of the overall asset management implementation. A draft of the state highway system management plan is required to be submitted to the Commission for comments by February 15th of each odd-numbered year, and Caltrans submitted the plan to the Commission on February 15th, 2019. Commission staff has reviewed the plan, prepared comments for transmittal to Caltrans, and have determined that it fulfills the requirements contained in the Streets and Highway Code. Additionally, Mike Johnson and his staff have done a really good job making changes from the 2017 plan to the 2019 plan. It has significant changes in formatting. It's easier to follow the math and how everything works, and we feel it's just a more user-friendly document to read. Some of the Commission comments range from items such as asking Caltrans to provide more information on Senate Bill 1 performance requirements for minimum level of service for pavements, potholes, spalls, and cracking, and also to provide more information on the requirement to fix an additional 500 bridges. In addition to Commission review of the plan, regional transportation agencies have been reviewing the plan and could provide comments to the plan up until last Friday, March 8th, 2019. Caltrans will address and incorporate these comments into the final 2019 plan, along with the comments provided by Commission staff. Caltrans is required to transmit the final plan to the Governor and Legislature by June 1st of each odd number year, and Caltrans will be providing an update to the Commission prior to the submittal at the May 2019 Commission meeting. Commission staff has reviewed the draft 2019 State Highway System Management Plan and recommends Commission approval of the comments presented in Attachment 1 to this item and transmittal of these comments to Caltrans.
Sorry, any questions, any discussion? Michael, did you want to say something?
No.
Wise man. We have a motion by Commissioner Van Konynenberg, a second by Commissioner Dunn. Any discussion? All in favor? Anybody opposed? Abstaining? That motion carries. Thank you. Okay, we will move on now to item 45, Caltrans update on planning documents. Garth?
Yes, Commissioners. Tab 45 is an informational item. Mr. Chris Schmidt, the Caltrans Chief of Division of Transportation Planning, will provide an overview of several upcoming important planning efforts by Caltrans. He will brief the Commission on the California Transportation Plan update, the Interregional Transportation Strategic Plan, the California Freight Mobility Plan, and the California Aviation System Plan. Except for the Freight Plan, all of these planning documents are in the early stages of development. The Commission has a statutorily designated role in all four of these planning efforts. Commission staff will monitor the development of each of these planning efforts. In addition to during key points in the development of these planning documents, the Commission will ask Caltrans to return and brief the Commissioners at future meetings. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Commissioners, for having me and presenting this broad swath of plans we're working on. As I joked at the RTPA meeting, planes, trains, and automobiles, a little bit of everything here. So the CTP is really the umbrella document that we use to really frame what we want the transportation system in the state to look like. So this is not the state highway plan. This is not centric to any particular mode. It's really a policy-driven plan that casts out a vision for the next 30 years for what we want the system to do. It's both required at the state and federal level, so both levels require us to do a plan. And it's really informed by what we do at the regional and modal planning level, so we anticipate incorporating what the regions are already planning for, and then we also incorporate the various planning efforts that we do for each mode individually, and I'll show you a slide on that a little later. It is performance-based, it is data-driven, we use lots of data, we forecast population, we look at movements throughout the state. Questions earlier about how we do that, we have a statewide travel demand model. It's informed by lots of different data to really understand what those travel patterns are. Notice it's fiscally unconstrained. It's a policy plan. It is not a project-based plan. So you're not going to see a big list of projects and identifying who gets funded and who doesn't. It will talk somewhat about revenues and talk about how projects get funded, but it's not what you might think of as like an investment plan. It's stakeholder guided, lots of outreach, lots of engagement, and lots of participation opportunities. And it does try very hard to address both urban and rural areas of the state because the state is so diverse. So a big part of the 2050 plan and how it's a little bit different from the 2040 plan that we adopted, it's to really look at these new changing modality issues in the transportation sector. What's going on with technology and how do we incorporate that into our planning? Lots of concern about equity in our transportation funding decisions and who's benefited. Also the relationship of transportation and housing. Public health, transportation, and public health are very closely linked, so really want to understand that. Lots of conversations about climate change, the adaptation and resiliency of this system, and how do we plan for that. Also focus on innovation. What is the new future? We don't always know, and certainly over a long planning horizon, it's hard to anticipate those, but we do want to talk about those potential opportunities. What are the new challenges? What do we see as challenges? Certainly climate change is one of those. And then also identifying new strategies to identify new mobility opportunities. We're also looking at new scenario planning. What futures do we actually want to see? How do we shape that future? What are most likely futures potentially, depending on what happens in terms of regional growth, statewide growth, et cetera, or for that matter, the economy? And how do we prepare for that? So the last one there is planning for implementation. A plan is only as good as it's implemented, so we're definitely focusing on implementation steps as well. So the CTC's role here, as Garth mentioned earlier, the Commission does authorize the guidelines that are actually used for the production of the CTP. That was done in 2014, or at least based on the 2014 requirements. Also, SB 391, which is very important, is really the touchstone here, which relates to meeting the greenhouse gas emission requirements set out for the plan itself. And then, as mentioned previously by Garth, that the Commission staff are involved on the Policy Advisory Committee when we start having those meetings. Here's a quick schedule. The plan was kicked off in 2018 really aggressively. We've done some visioning efforts. We've produced a number of white papers, and we're currently working on various scenarios and workshopping those with folks to kind of engage them in looking at what those potential futures might be. We will have a first draft here in the middle of 2019, hopefully in July. We would then be bringing that also back to you all for your consideration. And then ultimately it goes through additional public outreach and stakeholder engagement towards adoption by the end of 2020. So I mentioned earlier that the plan really is an umbrella document under which we have other modal plans. Many are listed here. The ones down in the bottom box are the ones I'm going to discuss next. But really think of the CTP laying out a big policy framework, and then within the structure of how we deliver transportation, we kind of take a closer look at each mode. So the ITSP, often referred to sort of as the highway plan, it's really the interregional transportation plan. We're looking at what happens with interregional travel statewide. Our regional partners are responsible for regional transportation planning. They develop those plans on a regular basis and do a great job at doing that. We're looking out for the overall interregional travel throughout the entire state. That plan is developed by Caltrans, and it does look at multimodal investments as well. Again, it is the foundational basis for how we develop the ITIP, the Interregional Transportation Improvement Program, and the projects that are nominated for that. That was last approved in 2015, and it was consistent with the then adopted 2040 California Transportation Plan. So we're very much in alignment. And there will be an update in 2021 that we'll be working on to bring that in alignment also with the 2050 CTP. Let me jump to the freight plan. The freight plan is really focused on freight, very important to our state's economy. Again, it's both required at the state and federal level. It's really, there's a couple of components which get a little bit confusing. It lays out a policy frame for what we want to do with freight in the state and acknowledging its importance to the economy and our job base, et cetera. The other federal compliant part is that it requires an investment plan that you all actually help determine by the allocations that you make to projects or when you program projects under the TSEP program. And that freight investment plan is tying up the federal dollars as well as the SB1 state dollars. When we combine them in the TSEP program, we're really programming both pots. And the federal government requires us to essentially have a plan that explains how the federal funds are used. And that's what the FIP is, the Freight Investment Plan. It's a component of that. And so that is really the sort of fiscal constraint of that plan. But we also have discussed quite extensively with our California Freight Advisory Committee the desire in this freight plan to have a freight investment strategy, to really lay out a smaller universe of key freight investment priorities that could be the basis for future funding. And I don't want to preclude what funding type or say necessarily what type, but certainly one of the things that we've messaged on is when there's federal reauthorization, for example, wouldn't it be great to have a very, very clear message to Washington to say these are the key freight investments that we need in California to be successful, so that when federal reauthorization considers how to spend or how to invest those federal dollars, that we have a clear message from California to say this is a list of our needs, this is the value of those projects. So that's something we're working on right now with our advisory committee. And we're trying to develop that investment plan. And that's gotten a lot of attention, and we're working with our regional partners and your staff to really make that as useful for all of you to also help guide the investment decisions you're asked to make. On the aviation plan, this is a plan that really looks at aviation in the state in a way that both is required by the PUC sections, but it also really looks at intermodal compatibility and aviation doesn't always get a fair shake. We're oftentimes talking here about general aviation, so we're creating a plan to acknowledge all of those resources in the state. It aligns with the number of priorities that we set out, including reductions of emissions associated with the aviation industry, and looks at future mobility opportunities and trends as well, and bringing aviation into a more sustainable framework as well. That plan is also underway. It's just getting started here in early 2019 with hopefully an adoption in 2020. So I'm going faster, and I think we dropped one slide, which was the schedule for the freight plan, which is to be adopted in 2019, by the way. So with that, I think you actually have the old slide deck. This is a very confusing slide, so I'm going to get rid of that. But happy to take any questions.
Commissioner Alvarado?
Again, I just ask if we've included any of the ride-sharing data.
Yes, so the California Transportation Plan is taking a very, very hard look at that. And, this is an area that everyone is struggling with a little bit. How do you factor that into our forecasts and models? But we have a close eye on that very issue.
Commissioner Gometti?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chris, I just want to make sure, you're including general aviation airports in this?
Yes, that's correct. Both commercial and general aviation.
There's a lot of freight moving in and out of a lot of these general aviation.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Van Kynenberg.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. was at a meeting of rural transit operators here about 3 weeks ago, and many of them are struggling with trying to provide services in a scenario where costs are rising greater than they can recover in fare box recovery, and they're not meeting their fare box recovery requirements, yet they're trying to get mobility to rural areas. As you consider the transit portion of this, I would ask that we seem to have a mindset, and I think we're all guilty of it, of we have had these 30 passenger buses, and that's the way we've done transit. And that's the way most of us think about transit. Hopefully they'll bring some creativity, but also practicality, because what I heard from this meeting 3 weeks ago was transit operators who are really trying to provide mobility to some really hard areas to reach, and they're tried everything they can do, and they're not making it. So they need some help, some practical help. Let's make sure within this plan we address something like that. The second area I'd like to make sure that gets addressed is prior to 2015, there hadn't been an update to as far as I can tell, the Interregional Transportation Strategic Plan was a 1993 adoption, and so there was a long period between those times. The 2015 plan was very different from the 1993 plan in that many rural connector state routes were dropped from the plan. I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that many of those state routes that connect to our major routes are how some of the rural areas get goods and services to the port or out of state for export. And by dropping those, many projects that were actually not big dollar projects but important to minor state routes that help get freight moving to the major corridors could no longer be funded through the ITIP. And so things that were actually programmed that then were dropped in the 2016 funding drought could not be put into the program later on. I would really like to see a robust discussion around how some of the minor routes, minor state route that look minor in the big picture, but connect a lot of freight that comes out of some of our rural areas, get those back connected into the interregional strategic plan. Thank you.
We'll do that. Thank you.
Any other comments or suggestions? Just a quick question I have in terms of our transit forecast and our zero emission 2040 deadline. All that's factored in with our planning, and do we forecast increased ridership, and what are we using?
Well, this is where you get into the scenario planning. What kind of future do we want to see, and then what kind of future investments do we need to make that a reality? So I think, we are looking at meeting the greenhouse gas emission requirements that the state has set for itself. So that takes everything that you've heard from the regions and everything they're doing and putting that all together, and then making sure that there are strategies statewide that ultimately reduce the emissions from the transportation sector to where we need to be by 2050. That requires some level of modal shift and a clear reduction in overall vehicle miles traveled and the associated GHG. That probably means we need more transit ridership. That probably means we need more walking and biking going on. That means we're going to have more folks using rail, intercity rail, high-speed rail, and all sorts of other modalities. And that all has to be factored in as assumptions. Now, some of those can just be assumptions, and you can feed the model that and say, listen, I'm going to tell the state model that I want 10% transit mode share. The question is, how do you get there? What's the investment strategy then ultimately behind getting to that type of future? So the scenario planning that we're doing is taking those kinds of issues into account, including, for example, the question about micromobility and other transit solutions, or expansion of TNCs, or for that matter, autonomous vehicles and what that does. That's all being factored in. But it's got to also be somewhat reality-based, on how aggressive do you want to be on the assumptions for those technologies to actually be in place, and what are the policy drivers to make sure that they can actually be successful and be adopted. So we're doing all of that and providing scenarios for consideration to see how we get there, and advising on what kind of policy actions we may need to take to make that a reality. Does that help? I don't want to.
Well, it does. It just, we've spent a little bit of time with our Foothill Transit partners as they've been on their journey with the zero-emission buses, and it's very clear, at least to Director Branson and myself, that our transit partners are going to need a lot of help in terms of the infrastructure, and, buying the equipment is probably the easiest part of the equation, and getting the electricity there at an affordable price, and making sure the operations can be tweaked as they have to be tweaked, perhaps. So I think there's lots of unknowns there, and for us to help our partners get to the 2040 goal, whether it's a policy or resource, I think it'll probably be both in terms of how do we help our partners get there, because I'm not convinced that they will automatically get there in a very simple manner if we don't all lock hands or lock arms and make sure that we get folks, I'd like to say is between our energy partners and our transit partners, we don't even speak the same language. A load to my transit partner means something very different than a load to my energy partner, and I think that we need to really work hard and make sure that happens. Yes. Okay. Yes.
I think
Mr. Van
you hit on something,
Kynenberg.
because one of the things that was discussed 3 weeks ago was, yes, bringing the capability to charge a large bus to a rural area is really difficult. The thing that is also concerning is we spend all this money. SB1 allocated an additional $750 million a year. We spend all this money, and then 15 years from now, something has changed and people are finding mobility in other sources, and all this infrastructure improvements we made are for naught. And so I think there was a lot of discussion about we need to get out in front of, we don't want to waste all this money we're spending in the future. So, as we look at this, this is critical to have a real, yes, we want zero emission buses, but are zero emission buses the answer? 30 passenger zero emission buses the answer 10, 15, 20 years from now?
I would agree, and I think Commissioner Dunn's pushing her button.
Just another quick question. How we've heard this from CARB and we've seen it from OPR, and it's different than greenhouse gas reduction. It's a focus on reduction in vehicle miles traveled. How is that factored into these planning documents?
So vehicle miles traveled is really one of the primary metrics for how you calculate greenhouse gas emissions. So when you look at the transportation sector and you determine, what is the GHG footprint of the transportation sector, you're really, many times you're looking at how the system is used, and that's on a per vehicle mile traveled basis. And there's different ways of calculating VMT, so I don't want to necessarily get into the details of that, but fundamentally that is the euphemism, or that is the metric for GHG. And
But that's not exactly correct if we're moving to 5 million electric cars.
right,
Because
so
that's a different, you can have increased VMT, but an electric vehicle that doesn't give you GHG reduction, right?
yes, and but. So at the end of the day, yes, we may one day hopefully be at a zero emission future where all vehicles are zero emission. That's going to take a very long time. So while we're on that path, and all the numbers that CARB has run also requires VMT reduction on a per capita basis. So that's the part that's a little bit hard to sort of understand in the meantime, because ultimately that energy still needs to be produced in some manner. We're not on a zero emission energy generation future yet either. We're still generating those through fossil fuels being burned, whether that's gas, coal, or others. We're obviously on a path in California not to do that. But ultimately, it's not just moving to zero emission vehicles. That's not enough. You have to also reduce VMT. And there are certain sectors where that's much more difficult. The freight sector is certainly struggling with that. You mentioned the transit sector. The transit sector has an opportunity to be used as an opportunity for public investment to make sure those zero emission technologies get implemented. And you get a lot of good proof of concepts, whether it's an electrified 30-foot bus or if it's a micro vehicle that also provides that level of service. And that technology then can be upscaled to larger vehicles, including over-the-road trucking, which is really the tough part in terms of the adoption of that. So, we have to overall, even as we're moving towards a zero-emission future, we have to reduce VMT in addition to that.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the most fascinating thing for me to read in your planning documents, particularly when you look at the fact that you can't put all of our housing needs in transit-oriented development areas. You have to build out into edge development. And the fact that, as Bobby has mentioned, Commissioner Alvarado has mentioned, trying to factor in ride sharing, when Wall Street Journal just announced that, there's a $1 billion investment by a bank in Uber for autonomous vehicles. And our public is demanding more flexibility with more vehicles. And so this is going to be interesting tension between meeting state climate change goals and public expectation for being able to get to the places they want to get to with the freedom that they want to do that. So I'm really intrigued by this conversation because I think it's going to be far harder than any of us could possibly imagine. And you get to go to heaven with this one.
Well, I agree. And we have to remember, it's a plan. And plans are intended
Not till 2050.
Right, to sort of foreshadow things. And sometimes in plans you get things wrong, but you test various things and you try to understand what those courses might be. And we can make course corrections. And I think that's the important part.
So, Chris, you mentioned some white papers that you've developed. Are those easily available?
Yes, absolutely. In our website, which unfortunately we talked about all the plans, the California Transportation Plan, there's a very nice website for that, so you can look up materials there. We can also get you a couple of different white paper products. UC Berkeley helped us with the Future of Mobility white paper, which is very, very enlightening to us. And so we can share that with you and some of the interim products as well. So absolutely.
And then I would be interested in the nexus between the sustainable community strategies, because that really is intended to capture the goals of the greenhouse gas reductions and our mobility needs. And
10 years of failure.
Yeah.
Well, that's where we are. So
I was supposed to limit my time to 7 minutes. I'm way
Okay.
over. But fundamentally, that is absolutely correct. That our assumptions going into all of this is that all of those regional plans, which have SCSs baked into them, will be fully implemented as planned, yielding all of the emissions reductions that are hoped for. So, those are some of the fundamental assumptions. Now, is that necessarily going to happen? You've heard the challenges in previous joint meetings with CARB, and that tension that you mentioned earlier is real. That is a concern many folks in the audience have about their ability to fully deliver those emissions reductions. But that's what we have to do to meet the goal of the plan and the emissions that we need to gain in order to, avert this climate crisis that we're in the middle of.
not to worry, Comey's here. So he's going to figure it all out. So we see you back there trying to sit in the last row. Thank you, Chris. Okay, we're going to move on to item 46. Robert.
Commissioners, tab 46 is an information item. Guy Preston, the new Executive Director of Santa Cruz County Regional Transportation Commission, is here to provide an update on their corridor study and plans to reinstate passenger rail service on the branch line.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Guy Preston, Executive Director of the Santa Cruz County Regional Transportation Commission. I started this role on December 3rd, and I am now fully engaged in delivering transportation improvements in Santa Cruz County. I want to give a plug to Caltrans Office of Structure Construction. Like Director Berman, that's where I started my career, and I'm glad the path has taken me to now Santa Cruz. Thank you to the Commission for the opportunity to address you and provide an update on the status of the Santa Cruz branch line, which this Commission provided funding to assist the RTC in purchasing back in 2012. Prior to purchasing the line in 2012, the RTC prepared a business plan to guide the economics surrounding RTC ownership of the branch line. Several operational and maintenance scenarios were analyzed and helps guide the RTC in the management of the line, consistent with the conditions of the Proposition 116 funds that were used to buy the line. The plan is based around having a short line operator to provide freight and recreational passenger rail service, while allowing additional studies and improvements on the line for potential future commuter transit service. Having lost our initial short-term operator due to its failure to perform, the RTC recently entered into a new administration, coordination, and license agreement with Progressive Rail for the next 10 years. With the passage of Measure D in 2016, the RTC became a self-help county. To help guide the investments identified in the Measure D expenditure plan, which includes an expenditure category for rail corridor infrastructure preservation and analysis of options, the RTC performed a unified corridor study. The study analyzed 3 parallel routes, including Highway 1, the local road network, and the railway. This study is consistent with the CTC guidelines for multimodal solutions for congested corridors. The RTC unanimously affirmed a scenario to leave the railroad infrastructure in place, continue freight and passenger rail in the near term, and advance opportunities for high-capacity public transit service on the rail line. That was a 12-0 vote. Our next step is an alternatives analysis, which we plan to use to help simplify the future environmental analysis of high-capacity public transit on the rail line. While we continue to study transit alternatives, the RTC is actively maintaining the line. In 2017, there was significant damage to the line. The RTC is receiving assistance from FEMA and Cal OES for the 2017 storm damage projects, which will start going to construction this year, with completion expected next year. We are also performing bridge inspections to help identify continued maintenance needs. We are working on building a trail adjacent to the rail line and just certified an environmental impact report for one of several projects under development. All of our trail projects preserve the rail corridor for future transit use. We are working with the Caltrans Division of Rail and the Transportation Agency for Monterey County on a strategy for network integration planning for future potential intercity rail service on the Central Coast. This week, we are submitting a grant application to Caltrans for sustainable transportation planning funds to assist with this effort. With that, I am happy to confirm that the RTC is meeting its Proposition 116 commitments to the CTC and would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yep, Commissioner Gometti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'm the only one up here that's been here long enough from the start of this project in August of '03. I applaud you for trying to get this thing back on track. My concern is I don't see a business plan in front of us, nor a schedule for passenger rail. Have you developed that yet?
We do have a business plan, but it's based on recreational and freight traffic. We don't have a business plan for passenger rail commuter service at this time. We need to perform additional analysis on what the appropriate use of the line would be for transit service, how what revenue sources are available to not only clear the project environmentally, but also to build and operate the project. At that time, it would be appropriate to update the current business plan to a business plan that includes commuter rail service.
Can you give the commission a timetable or a schedule of when we're going to start to see something?
So we expect to do our alternatives analysis in the coming year. And by the end of next year, we should be able to start an environmental process. And at that point, I think it would be appropriate to start looking at a business plan that included passenger rail service. We don't have funding for it right now. So it's very hard to together a full business plan that would include commuter rail service right now. But I do think that that's coming in the future.
Well, let's see, 2003 to 2019, we can't wait much longer. So is there any way to expedite this?
Well, we would certainly be happy to accept whatever funds are available to assist us in working through an environmental document. Our sales tax measure provided 8% for additional analysis and for maintenance of the line. Right now, our measure is only 2 years old, so we need to accumulate enough money and we need to work on grant applications to be able to put together enough funding to do an environmental analysis. We've received a lot of support from Caltrans, and we know what funding opportunities are out there, and we're positioning ourselves so we can be able to do that.
I'd appreciate it if you'd work with our staff and put together some sort of schedule, as nebulous as it might be. We really just don't have a schedule in front of us.
I can appreciate that.
So you mentioned Progressive Rail, and you have a 10-year agreement with them. Was that based on performance metrics? Because you had one short line deal that didn't work out. So is this business plan around freight and recreational all tied to that plan and some performance metrics?
There are performance metrics in the agreement itself. Right now, the line is non-operational past Watsonville due to the storm damage projects. So once that agreement was put into place, the short-term operator, Progressive Rail, has a year to get to us a plan for what they plan on doing for freight service north of Watsonville, as well as transportation services, which would primarily be excursion rail service. That would be consistent with the business plan that we put together before we purchased the line, but that plan, as Commissioner Giametti mentioned, would need to be expanded to include commuter rail service.
Well, but you have some kind of business plan available
Yes.
today. No, but for the other one, so in the meantime, so we're just, and I don't know if it's not operational, it sounds like the short line really isn't able to fulfill their agreement, so is it a 10-year starts whenever they can start?
No, the 10-year started once the agreement was put into place, but they acknowledged the fact that there had been damage on the line and that we would need time to repair the line before they could start operations on it. So those milestones were placed into the agreement, and there are performance metrics on how, once the rail is back into service, what amount of freight traffic and what amount of transportation services need to be provided, and the RTC does collect a royalty on those.
And so do you have the resources to get that line back so it can be put into service?
Yes, we do. We were eligible for all storm damage projects from FEMA as well as Cal OES, so we should be fully reimbursed for the repairs that are needed.
Okay, well, to Commissioner Giametti's request, maybe that schedule that we're going to see, we could see the whatever the viable interim business plan is as well, would be helpful. Any other? Yes, Commissioner Van Kennidenberg.
So previous, your predecessor was here with different projects for capacity increases on Highway 1 through the area, talking about the congestion. So are you going forward with a multimodal congestion, plan, solutions for congestion plan for this area?
Yes, we are. The reference Unified Corridor Investment Study that I had in my presentation analyzed 3 routes, including Highway 1, the rail line, and local street network. And we're looking forward to moving forward with all 3 improvements on all 3 corridors. Congestion in Santa Cruz is unbelievably bad. Not one corridor is going to solve the problem. So we're looking and we're working with CTC staff on putting together an application for congested corridors that would include Highway 1, would also include the trail adjacent to the rail line, and then we're working with Caltrans Division of Rail to try to advance rail service.
Thank you. Okay, we do have one public speaker, Brian Peoples. I'm going to ask you to limit your comments to 3 minutes, please.
Hi, my name's Brian Peoples. I'm Executive Director of Trail Now. I'm representing thousands of businesses and residents in Santa Cruz County, including the farmers, which make up 2/3 of the corridor, the farmland does. And I'm here to talk to you about helping us resolve this contentious issue we have in our community over the train. The train is really a bad idea for our community, and the evidence has shown it to be that. If you look at the actual data from the studies that they've done, actually the train has zero impact on traffic, and it's not affordable. And the only reason they voted for the train plan is to protect Proposition 116 funds. That's the fact. We also have many trestles. It's a little off, but many historical trestles. You're going to destroy these historical trestles for 60 trains a day going 45 miles an hour? That's not going to happen through our community. We're going to be, there's an uproar against that because the corridor is not wide enough. It's 27 feet wide. You can see from the video or the shots, it's right through our community. And that does not work for our community. It goes along the coastline and the cliffs. And one of the most frustrating things is that our tax dollars are going towards a private excursion train. They're spending $1.6 million to maintain this corridor, and they're committing $15 million to upgrade the corridor for excursion trains. That's for 20 years we're going to have excursion trains. We also had a ballot measure passed called Measure L that was against the train in Capitola. So the community, we have 10,000 signatures, and there's multiple lawsuits going on against the local transit agency. We're asking for you, the California Transportation Commission, to help us. Active transportation. We actually have the funds. You want the Proposition 116 money? We're here. Our local community is here with the funding. We have Silicon Valley investors. We're ready to bring money, but the local agency is not willing to work with the private groups because they're so buried under this Proposition 116 requirement. That Proposition 116 is holding our community hostage. It really is holding our community hostage. The actual study that they did showed that the trail would reduce traffic congestion on Highway 1 with 800 people using it an hour. That will, for active transportation, that will reduce it. And there's schools. There's schools all along there. We can't wait. We can't wait. We can't allow Proposition 116 to hold our community hostage. We have the funds. We're asking for your help. Please. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes, Commissioner Gometti.
Well, I guess my question is, it's really a community decision. You know,
It's not for us.
Proposition 116 was to provide rail service, and that's why the money went to the community. Now, if the community wants to get together and reimburse the state for that acquisition, that's really a community issue, not an issue before this commission. So they need to figure that out.
Madam Chair,
yes.
can I suggest staff come back and get a legal opinion as to whether or not the county has satisfied the requirements of Prop 116, or if the requirements have not been satisfied per the state, and if there's any open question as to, because they provided there at one point there was a short line railroad, and I think that was one of the requirements. I'm not sure of all the other requirements, and so maybe at some point in the future we can get an opinion on what requirements have been met and what haven't. Did I miss that? Okay.
Susan, did you want to address that?
Well, the Proposition 116 funds can be used, when I look at the resolution in the staff report for both freight rail and I can't find it quickly here, but freight rail as well as recreational passenger service. To the extent that there was a concern that Santa Cruz was going to pull the whole rail line out, to the extent they continue to operate the line, which right now they are, we understand they've got a freight rail operator back. They are working on getting their storm damage cleaned up, and they're going to use that rail for recreational service. It appears they're meeting the intent. Ultimately, they do have the plan for the passenger rail as well, the commuter rail. So, we will work, commissioners, with Santa Cruz on bringing back for you a schedule and timeline. We'll do that, and we'll also work with Santa Cruz to see if it's possible to get an interim high-level business plan that, is not as fine-tuned as it sounds like we can get at this point in time that the commission would like to see, but at least we'll bring something back to you. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Did you say a business plan?
Staff will work with Guy
efficiency
on a high. Yeah, we'll work with Mr. Preston on a high-level timetable business plan for the overarching goal for the passenger rail service that goes beyond the recreational service. Is that acceptable? Okay.
Okay. Thank you. We'll move on to the next item then, which is 47. Chris?
Yes, Commissioners, item number 47 is an information item on the project delivery quarterly report for the second quarter of fiscal year 2018-2019. Government code requires the department to report to the Commission quarterly for projects and that have completed construction in the previous quarter. The report contains information on the approved capital and support budgets compared to expenditures at contract construction acceptance for all major shop projects. Mike Keever is here and will be presenting highlights from the report to the Commission today.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Chairman, I know we're pressed for time. Would you like my full report or a curtailed version? What's your pleasure?
I think we might have to do curtailed, just because we've been informed that the gracious hospitality of Metro, they need to use this room again at 5 p.m., so we're going to be out of a little bit of time. Commissioner Gilmetti?
Mike, let me make a suggestion. We used to kind of get together a small group and talk to you guys about some of the things in this report. I think Carla was part of that. That kind of disappeared. I'd like to see us have that little dialogue again to go over this rather than take the time to go over little pieces of this thing.
We'd be happy to do that.
If we could set that up. Yeah.
We will set that up, Commissioner.
It's pink and blue, Bobby, but. Okay, since you're up at the podium, the Cliff Notes, high level.
Absolutely. So we're going to be reporting on the multiple phases that we have with our project delivery. Of course, we check in with you phase by phase through the delivery process. With regard to the risks, part of what I'd like to accomplish through this report is we're trying to balance risks with delivery. And so this will be your opportunity to assess how we're doing with that balance. We can't afford to take no risks. I think that's a little bit of what Clark was talking about earlier when he was talking about the CCI. If we tie up too much money, then just in case, we won't have enough projects in our portfolio. If we're too cautious, we're going to push our dates out too far. That's another aspect of this. So we're trying to balance those risks, including with our delivery report. At a high level, if you focus on the year-end projection, the second column from the right, we're generally on track. We do expect to meet most of our contract for delivery. Compared to historic, where we are after the second quarter, a lot of our heavy lifting is in the third and fourth quarter. Our year-end projection, we did change at Commissioner Galmetti's suggestion from, we removed the goal column, and instead what we provided you on the far right column is what's our last 5 years delivery average for a comparison. And we hope that that's more useful to you as opposed to a goal. So you can kind of see where we are at this point, realizing we still have risks. So I'll get into the risks a little bit when we get into the watch list. With regard to our delivery, at the completion of construction, we do a report, and it goes into the appendix of the quarterly report. For the full funding for our STIP projects, we delivered 12 STIP projects. We did expend about 10% more than the budget. There's a supplemental table that's also in your report that shows the allocations that you provided, the state funds for these, because the STIP projects often have multiple funding. We were within budget, so we used about 90% of the funds that were allocated through the commission. On the shop projects, through the second quarter, we've delivered 143, and the overall budget, we delivered those within 90% of the allocated funds. So overall, there's highs, there's lows, but overall we're staying generally within budget. With regard to the risks, right now we have 15 projects that we see looking ahead in the next 6 months that could come to you for a greater than 120. Now, some of this is, we're trying to clear the pipeline, if you will. So we've talked about the bidding environment, and we're trying to make the adjustments. Some of these bidding changes occurred in the delivery year, and so the opportunity to come to you to make an adjustment once we're in the delivery year is when we come to you for allocation. So rather than waiting to see how the bids open, we're trying to be proactive, and you may be seeing these coming in for a greater than 120. If you look, though, at the allocations after bid opening, we're starting to see a reduction in those. So we don't have so many on the agenda as book items this commission meeting, and we're looking ahead, and we see two on our watch list for the next 6 months currently. So I think we're starting to see an adjustment, and I'll refer to that in the slides to come. I also wanted to mention, when you look at the risks, I show that risk curve, and I've often mentioned 85 cents of the project dollar are spent during the construction phase, and what we're trying to do is reduce the risk before we get to construction. I think that's reflected to some extent here. We're talking about 12 projects with a risk of $73 million out of 725 projects currently in construction, valued at $8 billion, or almost $9 billion. And so these are risks that are on the watch list that are high or very high. Historically, we'll manage many of these, and we won't need to come back for any sort of a supplemental, and that's reflected in the tables that we show here. So the first one are supplementals to award. We have had, through the first 2 quarters, 25 supplementals to award. If you look at the past 5 years, that's higher than typical. It reflects the bidding environment that we've seen, and it represents about 2.5% of the dollars we've come forward for allocation. If you look at the construction phase, through the first quarter, we've had one project where we've requested a supplemental to complete construction. We'll see more potentially. We have one on the agenda for this meeting. But I was talking about making adjustments with regard to the bidding environment. If you look in July, on average, our engineer's estimate was 17% lower than the bids that we were opening. We made a pretty quick adjustment to that through the months between July and September, perhaps overcorrected, where we were 6% over the bids that were opening. And now we're getting closer to aligning ourselves, where our engineer's estimate is close to the bids that we're opening. The other thing I wanted to mention is we're tracking the construction cost index. And I've mentioned in previous meetings and workshops how that was going up 9, 10, 11% a quarter. The last quarter, it actually went down 10%. It's known to be, it's volatile, and that's part of what Clark was talking about. But it does give an indication there may be multiple reasons why we're coming in better alignment. We're also seeing a little bit of an increase in the number of bidders. That could be seasonal or could be an adjustment that we're seeing. So between the adjustment that the Caltrans staff are making, the number of bidders, and the cost index reversing itself from the last 3 quarters that were spiking up, we're starting to see a better alignment with our bids.
Commissioner Kehoe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This adjustment that you're talking about, where would the other bidders, new bidders come from? Out of state, or because we've been hearing for such a long time that it's going to be very competitive because of all the SB1 money?
So
Now it's going counterintuitive, right?
the additional bidders are the bidders per project. It may be current contractors that are bidding on this, but we are seeing some indications that there are some additional contractors coming in to do work in California, particularly with, I think, the stability provided by the continuation of SB1. It also could be a softening of the economy. Housing starts aren't at the same rate that they were, and so that could be reflected in the number of bidders that we're seeing as well.
Any further questions? Okay, thank you, Mike. Okay, we're going to have to wrap up for today, so we're going to close our meeting for today, and I would ask the commissioners to, you can leave your stuff, but pack it neatly so someone else can sit in your chair and work starting at 5. So, no, you don't have to take it. You just have to make a neat workspace. So, with that,